Welcome to the WTR Healthcare Happenings podcast. I'm your host, Tim Gerdeman, Vice Chair and Co-founder and Chief Marketing Officer of Water Tower Research. In today's podcast, we welcome back Nick Kadysh, founding CEO and President of Toronto-headquartered life sciences company, PharmAla Biotech, OTCQB ticker symbol MDXXF, focused on the commercial manufacture of clinical-grade MDMA and the development of related novel chemical entities targeting CNS disorders. Nick is also board chair at Psychedelics Canada, also known as PsyCan, a not-for-profit trade association representing Canadian psychedelic medicine and therapy companies. So let me first welcome our guests, Nick and Robert Sassoon, for being on today's podcast.
Hey, Tim. Good to see you again.
Great to be here too.
Nick, just to kick things off, and again, welcome back to the podcast, by the way. The last time we talked back in June, we got your insightful perspectives on the Trump FDA and its approach to psychedelics. That podcast came soon after your own interaction with the FDA. Have you had further interaction with the regulator since then? And if so, were any additional snippets of interest that you can share with us regarding their approach to psychedelics? Sorry.
Yeah, of course. Look, I haven't had any further interaction with the agency. No, June wasn't that long ago. But I think the news just hit last week that they announced their first priority voucher recipients. So at the time when we spoke in June, I think they had sort of floated this idea of a priority vouchers program, and they now announced it. And one of the drugs that was listed in that priority vouchers program was not a novel drug. It was a ketamine for domestic manufacturing. So basically, anyone who has an application before the agency that they want to manufacture ketamine in the United States of America now gets, I guess, priority review, priority access. They were saying sort of 2-month review timelines, which is for the FDA incredibly aggressive. So clearly, they see that there is an unmet need, if nothing else. I hate putting words in the regulator's mouth, but clearly they have determined that ketamine, which I think that the growth in ketamine is entirely related to mental health and entirely related to the fact that there are no other sort of psychedelic-like molecules available in the actual commercial supply chain. Coupled with the massive growth that Johnson & Johnson has seen with Spravato, their esketamine program. It's at a $2 billion run rate now, right? So clearly inside the agency, they've seen this and they've said, okay, there's a clear need for us to move faster on some of this stuff. So good indications.
Great. I appreciate those insights, Nick. And I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague, Robert Sassoon, to ask a few questions.
Yeah. Hi, Nick. Great to see you again. Since you were last on this podcast, the public release of unredacted details of the Lykos complete response letter, or CRL, in line with the unprecedented policy of the transparency being pushed by the Trump FDA, raised a few eyebrows and some concerns. So basically, it was like washing Lykos's dirty linen in public. But at least what we read in the media, some argue that it has solidified the regulatory caution towards MDMA and other psychedelics, with the path to approval now going to be longer, trials more expensive, requiring to be far more rigorously designed. So, Nick, I'd be interested in getting your thoughts on the disclosures, the FDA's deep-seated concern about functional unblinding, the safety reporting gaps, question marks about the durability and long-term efficacy, and consistency of the psychotherapy component of the therapy. So I'll be really interested to get your take.
Yeah, they're broad. So look, I read with interest the complete response letter. I'll say a couple of things. First is I like the fact that the FDA has moved to publicize their responses to applicants, right? I think it's much easier for us in industry to work towards what the agency says it wants when it's not a black box, right? Like I prefer to know rather than guess. And so I actually applaud the FDA for putting this out. I understand that it's not a pleasant process for applicants, and maybe if I was Lykos, then the shoe would be on the other foot, and I would be saying like, how dare they release this information? But especially in this context where Lykos was front running for the entire industry, and where this was the first sort of rubber meets the road interaction between a company submitting for full approval of one of these drugs. I think it's incredibly helpful for us in industry to have the full roadmap, right? The second thing I will say is I kind of agree with Lykos. So there are some portions of this that I think are really on Lykos. There was some liver toxicity endpoints that just weren't included. I think FDA should have caught it and not accepted the application without that data. But okay, sure, granted, it should have been in the application. It wasn't. There are other parts that I agree with Lykos on. So, you know, we when you're a regulator and you make a deal with a company, right? And I don't care what that deal is, but in this context, it was all around trial design, which is the purpose of the Breakthrough Therapies program. I can go on nobody's word but the people who are speaking publicly. But Rick Doblin has been very public about the fact that, they had these meetings, they designed these trials. This is like 7 years ago now, right? With an understanding that it is difficult, if not impossible, to functionally unblind a drug which has these kinds of subjective effects. Like, in the same way that it would be, I think, very difficult, if not impossible, to functionally unblind something like, I don't know, any of the ADHD drugs, which are stimulants and have very palpable, like, sort of effects. They're strong stimulants, right? So I don't know that there's a way out of this that gets us to an approved MDMA or an approved psilocybin without at least figuring out what the agency wants to see. I don't think it's possible to completely unblind these drugs. Our solution at PharmAla has been to focus on getting a lot of really strong real world evidence to supplement the clinical trial data. So in the last year, we've started doing two things. One is, rather than running our own clinical trials on generic MDMA, we're doing a lot of deals now that are in progress. We've completed one or two where we're providing drug to researchers on a no cost basis or low cost basis, but we get licensed to their data, right? Which we can use in submissions to regulators and insurance companies and all the like. So that's one. And then two, because we supply a lot of MDMA into actual patients' hands, right, in countries that allow it, it gives us access to real world evidence. And the combination of those two things is, I would think, somewhat persuasive. The real world is never blinded. There's no control for, like, a treatment in a clinic, right? You get treated. And what we've seen in countries like Australia, is our partners at Emeria, our customers at Emeria, have had such success in their treatments that they got Medibank, which is the largest private health insurance company in Australia, to basically fund the treatments. Now in two different clinics, Perth and Melbourne now. So clearly that group, who have a lot of experience looking at clinical outcomes data, looked at that and said, not only does this work enough that we want to fund it, we also think it's cost effective to fund it, right? Look, I think that that's where this will ultimately end, is the cat's out of the bag. People are getting treated. The evidence is very persuasive. You don't have to take my word for it. Emeria has published their real world evidence outcomes for several months running, and it seems quite durable. They're doing 6 and 9 month follow up. So eventually it becomes incontrovertible, and then it just looks like the agency is dragging their heels for no good reason.
Right. So MAPS is, they're they spawned Lykos. Their contention, you mentioned Rick Doblin, his contention was that the FDA treated Lykos very harshly, and the regulators simply moved the regulatory goalposts in the review process. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, to a certain extent, yes, I think I would. But it's, this does happen, right? Like, this is not the first time it's going to happen. Right. I really think that it's a hard ask for a regulator to be the first guy to approve MDMA.
Right.
You know, the second guy, he's going to be fine. But for the first guy, like you're taking on an awful lot of sort of political risk. Um, and I don't know that regulators are sort of insulated from positive outcomes. Nobody ever got fired for saying no. And so I think we in the industry have to take away all of their excuses to say no if we want to get this over the line. That said, in a country like Australia where there's already legal access, or a country like Canada where there's already legal access, I think that the incentives are somewhat flipped. And actually those regulators have maybe not a strong, but certainly an incentive to normalize how these drugs are treated in the context of their medical system.
Right. Okay. So interestingly, the authors of the CRL were from a previous administration. But do you see any contradictions or even irony that it was the Trump FDA that released the CLR, despite being a proponent, as you mentioned in our previous podcasts back in June, that they were proponent of a new regulation. And just to follow up on that, have the regulatory differences, as you mentioned, Australia and other countries, have the regulatory differences between the US and other jurisdictions on MDMA and other psychedelics widened?
I think they have. Um, we recently announced that we signed a distributor in New Zealand. New Zealand made no formal announcement on this, again, because I think regulators are sort of skittish and hesitant on it. But one day out of the blue, the New Zealand government said, "Hey, we've authorized this prescriber to prescribe psilocybin." And then simultaneously, I started getting emails from folks in New Zealand saying like, "Hey, we're psychiatrists, we're research psychiatrists, we've got experience with this class of drugs, and we have gotten the go ahead from our regulator, MedSafe, to start applying to become authorized prescribers for MDMA as well." So, you know, number one, I think there has been a pretty significant sort of widening between how the FDA views this and how other countries view it. The number of countries has increased. So New Zealand is one. On the psilocybin front, Germany's made an announcement. Czechia's had a legislative change, right? And then lest we forget, like Switzerland continues to move forward on treatments. Over 1,000 people have been treated with MDMA in Switzerland to date, right? And so again, we're doing like 25 different clinical trials right now, supplying various amounts for various indications. Ultimately, you can't continue to hold the line because at a certain point, perceptions also flip, and then you start to look like you're just like behind the eight ball. Like why have all these other countries approved through whatever mechanism they have to approve, and then you're like the last holdout. It starts to look bad.
Yeah. I mean, and so going back to the first point that I made and that you made actually in June is that you believed, I mean, based on your discussions with the FDA and other anecdotal evidence that they're really a big proponent. They were at that time a big proponent of deregulation. I assume that hasn't changed.
I think they are. I don't think that they released the Lykos complete response letter, number one, to be punitive to Lykos. I actually think it's somewhat helpful. But the other thing is, it's not. They didn't just release the Lykos CRL. They released a whole bunch of them, right? That one is just the only one that is really relevant for us in the psychedelics world. But I think that there's a conscious effort on the part of the current administration to be more open about the decision-making processes within the FDA, in part to open them up to criticism. It's one thing for Rick to go on stage and say, they treated us unfairly. Now with the release of the complete response letter, I think people can kind of read it and come to their own conclusions, which is valuable. Like, look, I've always thought that sunlight is the kind of the best disinfectant. And not everyone will agree that Lykos was treated unfairly. I don't exclusively hold that view. I think there are some elements that were fair and some elements that were very unfair.
Right, great. So PharmAla is a major supplier of GMP grade MDMA and analogues. So can you give us a more accurate perspective of what's really happening with respect to the demand for therapeutic MDMA, especially following the following the Lykos CRL, and what's going on in the research world?
Yeah. So post Lykos, when they got the response last year, we initially thought that it was going to generate a slowdown in clinical research. It did not. It generated like a big ramp up actually in clinical research. And we're now getting sort of requests for research materials from institutions that like I never thought I would hear from, like government researchers in all sorts of jurisdictions, big research universities. Lykos, actually, this is public. It's been reported that Lykos, in the wake of that CRL, sent us a number of research projects that they no longer thought that they could sustain. So that actually sped up. What slowed down was patient treatments, because I think people are very influenced by what they hear in the press, and so they heard like MDMA not approved, and they assumed that that meant no efficacy. And so it took about a year for things to get back on track in terms of patient treatments in those jurisdictions where it's allowed. It didn't generate a slowdown in psilocybin, as far as I can see, because psilocybin wasn't the drug in question, and so people didn't sort of have this visceral reaction. But part of the reason why, as I said, like we supply so many clinical trials, is I want to generate as much data as humanly possible. I want there to be like a flood of data, right? Because that's how we sort of we move the needle on this stuff. And I'm pretty happy about like how we've done in terms of getting these clients all set up. In the next 3 months, we have, we just made a delivery to Johns Hopkins. That's going to be a great clinical trial. Hopkins, obviously world renowned. But we have a couple of VA trials that are coming up. And then in the next 6 months, we have a trial that we're supplying being funded by the US military. It's actually for active duty military personnel. It's situated in both the University of Texas and at Emory University in Georgia. That kind of officially makes MDMA a dual use drug, which is, to my mind, very, very cool. I myself, next week, I'm heading to Saudi Arabia for the Global Health Expo, where we're going to be speaking to a bunch of actually like military psychiatrists. And so, the applicability of the drug only grows. In Canada, the CIHR, the Canadian Institutes for Health Research, just funded a very large multi-site trial looking at chronic neuropathic pain. And this is for MDMA as well. So, number of indications keeps growing, the number of clinical trials keeps growing. Patient treatments slowed down, but are now speeding back up again. And we've definitely seen an uptick in investor interest based on the stock chart of Atai and a couple of others. So I think very promising stuff.
Yeah, great. So finally, from me, maybe you can update us on your own clinical development programs, and specifically do the concerns in following the Lykos CRL, especially those tied to a function unblinding, make the development of PharmAla's less intense MDMA analogues a more attractive and less risky path forward?
Yeah, I definitely think so. Of course, we have also made some of our own decisions in the wake of that. So originally, we had been looking at the indication of social anxiety in autism because it's an orphan indication, and we thought that the regulators would be more amenable to an application for an orphan indication. And we have since decided to go broader. So we're going to be looking at social anxiety general population. It's a bigger indication, of course, but based on, again, the knowledge that comes with the release of that CRL is exactly how they're sort of thinking about this stuff. And I don't think that we need to sort of box ourselves in with a niche indication. A drug approved in the general population for social anxiety can still be used to treat autistics, but an autism-specific drug cannot be used in the general population. So we're going broader. We've also set up a dedicated research and development entity, PharmAla Biotech Australia, which is going to be doing all of our clinical work moving forward. Partly because in Australia, like we have great relationships in Australia, we do a lot of work in Australia. There's a great tax incentive in Australia, but more importantly, the regulatory pathway that the TGA has created is very, very clear. So I'm less concerned about the ins and outs of clinical trial approval in Australia in the same way that I would be in the US or even in Canada.
Right.
And so, it's very capital efficient. So, you should see in the next little while a number of announcements from us, including, where we're going to manufacture the investigational medical product, some financing partners, the trial site, all that fun stuff.
Great. We'll look forward to monitoring that progress. So I'll leave it there. And thanks again, Nick, for your insights. They're always very valuable. So I'll pass it back to Tim.
Yeah, that was actually a really interesting conversation. So thank you, Nick Kadysh, founding CEO and president of PharmAla Biotech, OTCQB, ticker symbol MDXXF. And thanks to my equity research colleague, Robert Sassoon, for also joining us. And finally, a special thanks to the WTR producer and editor of the podcast, Krista Fitzpatrick. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to subscribe, as well as visiting www.watertowerresearch.com to stay up to speed on the company's small cap written research reports, podcasts, fireside chats, and conference schedules. We'll see you next time for another edition of the WTR Healthcare Happenings podcast.